There are many monsters in Tolkien's legendarium, but most of them share a similar origin and nature. You know, dragons are creations of the Dark Lord Melkor. Balrogs are his servants, orcs and trolls his soldiers. The very first werewolf was fed at his hand. The first of the Nazgul's fell beasts was nursed at the hand of his disciple, Sauron. The only named vampire was once Sauron's chief herald. In almost all cases, Middle-earth's monsters are either creations of the Dark Lords, or they are at least aligned with his agenda. But then there are the giant spiders, the spawn of Ungoliant, the siblings of Shelob. They aren't creations of Melkor's, and they aren't servants of Sauron's either. These things are something else entirely. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. Today I'll be talking about the mother of monsters, Ungoliant, and her daughter of darkness, Shelob, as well as some of the other spiders scuttling around Middle-earth. Now, when it comes to villains in Tolkien's writings, I don't think there are any quite as hardcore as the gloom-weaving destroyer of light, Ungoliant. There's also no villain quite as mysterious. In previous episodes, I've mentioned Thuringwethiel, the vampire lady who served Sauron during the tale of Beren and Luthien. And Thuringwethiel is super duper mysterious because there's just so little that's written about her. Ungoliant, on the other hand, is mysterious because things are written about her, but those things are absolutely wild. In some ways, I think Ungoliant might be thought of as sort of the other side of the coin to a character like Tom Bombadil. She is an enigma, wholly evil, but pretty impossible to explain or put into a box. Perhaps, like a Balrog, she is some sort of evil Maya who chose to take a spider's form, although she isn't mentioned among the other Maya in the Silmarillion, and if she is a Maya, she is a unique one. Alternatively, we could get a little fruitier with our hypotheses and suggest that maybe she is some manifestation of the void, or a personification of the discord that Melkor wove into the music of creation. But to be 100% honest, I reckon just like Tom Bombadil, Ungoliant is cheapened a little bit by trying too hard to make sense of her. Much like Tom Bombadil, Ungoliant simply is. Anyway, she first enters the story way back in time, during the years of the trees, before the sun or the moon even existed. In order to get to know her, one has to read the Silmarillion. And to make that long story short, I do have a whole playlist on this where I go into full detail. Melkor, the original Dark Lord, got himself imprisoned by the Valar of the Uttermost West for being such a dick to the First Elves. But after 3 long ages of imprisonment, he was finally released from his unbreakable chain and set free. After that, Melkor settled down, chilled out, and never did anything untoward ever again. I say sarcastically, at the beginning of a video about monsters. No, what Melkor did instead was come up with a plan to plunge the blessed realm of Valinor into eternal darkness, to destroy the divine trees that illuminate the Uttermost West and radiate ennobling magical light upon the High Elves who live there. This light is actually what makes the High Elves of the Uttermost West different from Middle-earth's Dark Elves. But in order to pull off this evil scheme, first Melkor needed an accomplice. So he journeyed beyond the borders of Valinor and came to a dark and forgotten place where the Valar's light does not shine, and their powers are muted, a place that is almost entirely deserted. Almost. In the Silmarillion, we are told, beneath the sheer walls of the mountains and the cold dark sea, the shadows were deepest and thickest in the world, and there, secret and unknown, Ungoliant had made her abode. Now, Tolkien gives us 3 very interesting pieces of information here that paint a fascinating picture concerning Ungoliant's origins, loyalties, and motivations. Firstly, the Eldar, the elves, knew not when she came, but some have said that in ages long before, she descended from the darkness that lies about Arda. Now, the darkness that lies about Arda is quite a difficult phrase to decipher. Arda is the planet upon which Middle-earth and the Undying Lands are both continents, so I suppose it could either mean Ungoliant came from what we might call outer space, she's an alien, or potentially it's a reference to the outer void beyond time and even creation itself. Either way, very unusual. We are also told that Ungoliant was a primordial spirit, and in the beginning she was one of those that Melkor corrupted to his service, but she had disowned her master, desiring to be the mistress of her own lust, taking all things to herself to feed her emptiness. This line is kind of the crux of what this video is about. Unlike Balrogs and dragons and werewolves and orcs, but just like her future daughter Shelob, Ungoliant really isn't a servant of the Dark Lords. They do on occasion work towards the same agenda, and they are united in their hatred of all good things, but even in the beginning, Ungoliant disowned Melkor. She was the mistress of her own lust, and she established herself as an independent source of evil. This really is a huge distinction between her and most of Middle-earth's other monsters. Anyway, after abandoning Melkor towards the very beginning of time, Ungoliant crept towards the light of the Blessed Realm, for she hungered for light and hated it. She took shape as a spider of monstrous form, weaving her black webs in a cleft of the mountains. There she sucked up all light that she could find, and spun it forth again in dark nets of strangling gloom, until no light more could come to her abode, and she was famished. This hunger for light, her insatiable appetite, is a hugely important part of Ungoliant's character, and it's going to be important when we get to Shelob too. It is with promises of limitless light to devour that Melkor convinces her to join him. His plan? She feasts on the brightest lights in all of Arda, the 2 trees of Valinor. Together, he and Ungoliant come to Valinor shrouded in a cloak of unlight. And this is another moment where we get to see just how atypical Ungoliant is. For the most part, in Middle-earth, and also I guess in real life, darkness isn't exactly a thing. Not in its own right. Darkness is merely the absence of light. Nothing is evil in the beginning, evil is merely a corruption of the good that was made by Ilúvatar. Darkness is what you get when light is removed. But Ungoliant's unlight is a major exception. We are told her webs aren't made of darkness, they are made of this unlight. What exactly unlight is, I can't really say, but Tolkien gives us a chilling description of what it does. As Ungoliant approaches the divine trees, she belches clouds of unlight, and the darkness that followed was more than loss of light. In that hour was made a darkness that seemed not lack, but a thing with being of its own. For it was indeed made by malice out of light, and it had power to pierce the eye, and to enter the heart and mind, and strangle the very will. And what's even more fascinating, although this unlight is entirely unique to Ungoliant, some kind of living darkness is also associated with her daughter. I am getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but in The Lord of the Rings we are told when Gollum first beheld Shelob, The darkness of her evil will walked through all the ways of his weariness, cutting him off from light and from regret. Similarly, when Frodo and Sam enter Shelob's lair, they walked as it were in a black vapour wrought of veritable darkness itself, that, as it was breathed, brought blindness not only to the eyes but to the mind, so that even the memory of colours and of forms and of any light faded out of thought. Night always had been, and always would be, and night was all. Isn't that a flesh-crawlingly disturbing description? Anyway, back to Shelob's mother. In the Silmarillion, during a time of festival and celebration, she and Melkor attacked Valinor's divine trees. Melkor plunged his spear into the core of each tree, and as their sap poured forth like blood, Ungoliant sucked it up. She drained the light from the trees, poisoned them, and withered them, root, branch, and leaf, until they were both dead. But still, Ungoliant thirsted for light. She drank dry the wells of Vada. Vada is the Lady of Light, and by the time she was done, she had swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Melkor was afraid. 2 of the deadliest lords of the Valar soon went after Ungoliant and Melkor to avenge the destruction of their trees, and I guess to bring them to justice, but they were both blinded and dismayed by the black vapours that Ungoliant belched. Then she and Melkor continue their crime spree. They commit the world's first ever recorded murder, they steal the super bright Silmarils along with lots of other jewels, and they flee together across the ocean to the dark lands of Middle-earth. Which is where things begin to fall apart between Ungoliant and Melkor. As I've said, she does not work for him. Her desires are her own, and in her mind, the evil will of a Dark Lord is neither here nor there. She wants to feed on light. He promised her light to devour, and in his possession he now holds the 3 Silmarils, the tastiest light left in the entire world. For within the crystal of the Silmarils is encased the last of the light of the divine trees that they just destroyed, except for the fruit and the flower that will go on to become the sun and the moon. So, Ungoliant demands the Silmarils for herself. The trouble is, Melkor desires them for himself, and thus begins one of the most intensely epic quarrels to exist pretty much anywhere in Tolkien's writings. After eating all of that light back in Valinor, Ungoliant has swollen to a vast size, and holding on to the hallowed Silmarils for so long that burn the flesh of any evil hand which touches them, Melkor was in agony, his power severely diminished. So, once again, Ungoliant spins her webs of unlight, and she uses them to strangle the Dark Lord. Melkor screams, and the sound of his scream is so terrible that the Balrogs are roused from their deep sleep beneath the earth. As she overpowers him, Melkor's Balrogs come upon her like a tempest of fire. Their whips of flame cut through her webbing, and eventually Ungoliant is forced to flee from the union of all Balrogs. This is among the most extreme showdowns of the Elder Days. Anyway, after scurrying south and failing to overpower the epicness of Queen Melian the Maya, the super powerful badass who's going to go on to mentor Galadriel, in time Ungoliant travels in a terror of darkness to a place known as Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror, which overlook Nandun Gortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death. There is no prize for guessing why they are called that. And here she dwells for a while, swiftly turning the area into one of the worst places in all of Middle-earth. But Ungoliant is not the only foul creature in this part of the world who makes the mountains so terrifying and the valley so dreadful. We aren't given many details, but we do know she encounters something that is, at least in appearance, similar to her. Other foul creatures of spider form inhabit these mountains, and when Ungoliant meets them, she soon mates with them, before eventually devouring them. And in so doing, she spawns the next generation of monstrous spiders who plague Middle-earth for centuries to come, the most famous of whom is, of course, her daughter. But after that, Ungoliant simply vanishes from the annals of history, and the only clue towards her eventual fate is a single sentence. Of the fate of Ungoliant no tale tells, yet some have said that she ended long ago, when in her uttermost famine, she devoured herself at last. As with all of Tolkien's some have said stories, there is quite a bit of wiggle room in how we choose to imagine this, but if it's true, it does seem like quite an appropriate ending for such a sinister and all-consumingly gluttonous character, so intimately associated with the void. She devours light, she spawns monstrous evil, and then, ultimately, she devours herself, too. Presumably re-devouring the light that has been trapped inside her. Anyway, I will move on to her daughter, Shelob, in just a minute. In some ways, I think Shelob is even more interesting than her mother, but before I get to her, I want to take a moment to discuss what exactly Tolkien meant when he described this mother-daughter duo as spiders. Because, on the one hand, Shelob is, of course, a giant spider. That's neither controversial nor particularly insightful. But, on the other hand, is she? The language Tolkien uses to describe Shelob is absolutely gripping, but if we look at the specifics of what he wrote, we will see that there is an awful lot of daylight between what he's describing and simply an overgrown arachnid. In The Lord of the Rings, we are told, most like a spider she was, but huger than the greatest hunting beasts. Great horns she had, and behind her short stalk-like neck was her huge swollen body, a vast bloated bag swaying and sagging between her legs. But the belly underneath was pale and luminous and gave forth a stench. Her legs were bent, with great knobbed joints high above her back, and hairs that stuck out like steel spines, and at each leg's end there was a claw. Before giving that physical description, Tolkien dwelt most on her great cluster of bulbous, insect-like eyes. He talks about her beak that dribbles venom, her impenetrable skin that's grown layer upon layer upon layer, and of course her iconic stinger. Now, it is possible Tolkien meant fangs when he wrote stinger, but if we take the description at face value, we will find that Shelob has a lot of features that spiders simply do not have. A neck, a beak, horns, claws, insect eyes, a stinger. I'm not trying to suggest Shelob isn't some spider-like monster, and clearly she is, but I think there's a lot more to her appearance than just spider, but bigger. And the spiders that Bilbo meets in The Hobbit, who we will later learn are Shelob's descendants, also have a couple of unspidery traits associated with them, most notably their bulbous insect-like eyes. Also, they can speak. But what's interesting, I think, is that regular real-world spiders do also seem to exist in Middle-earth. In the same chapter, where Bilbo meets Mirkwood's giant talking spiders, he also encounters small ones of ordinary size that are hunting butterflies. Thus, I think we can be confident typical spiders are among the many animals, or Kilvar, that were fashioned by the Valier Yavanna in the days before days, but additionally and completely independently of them, there was also an evil, monstrous thing called Ungoliant, who assumed a spider-like form and eventually mated with other, lesser monstrous things in spider form, and from their union came a new and separate race of monstrous giant spiders that dwelt in Nandun-Gortheb and Ered Gorgoroth, and later, Mirkwood. In real life, when Tolkien was a toddler living in what we now call South Africa, he was supposedly bitten on the foot by a tarantula, and the venom had to be sucked out of him by his nurse. As an adult, he said he had no memory of this, and he bore no ill will towards spiders because of it. But that hasn't stopped some fans from speculating that the magically evil venom of a spider sting, which plays a prominent role in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, draws some inspiration from this real-life event. However, Tolkien himself once gave a slightly different account of what motivated him to include malicious spiders so prominently in his writings, specifically The Hobbit. In an interview from 1957, he said, "I put in the spiders largely because this was, you remember, primarily written for my children, at least I had them in mind, and one of my sons in particular dislikes spiders with a great intensity. I did it to thoroughly frighten him. And it did." And while we're discussing the Mirkwood spiders of The Hobbit, there is also an interesting linguistic point to bring up here. While Bilbo is wearing his magic ring and taunting the spiders who've captured his friends, he sings them an insulting song that includes the words Attercop, Lazy Lob, and Crazy Cob. Now, I know I just read that thing about The Hobbit being primarily written for children, but one must never forget, first and foremost, Tolkien was a linguist, a professor of philology, and everything we associate with Middle-earth fundamentally grew from the soil of Tolkien's passion for language, specifically the Anglo-Saxons language, what we know today as Old English. Over 1,000 years ago, the Old English word for spider was attercop. Attor means poison, and cop means either head, or in some instances, lump. Isn't it funny that the Anglo-Saxons word for spider was literally just poison lump, or poison head? Over time, the attor part of the word got dropped, and the word for spider simply became cop. And centuries later, as Old English evolved into Middle English, the P sound in cop became a B sound, cob. Now, cob has pretty much entirely fallen out of modern usage, but we do still say cobweb, a relic left over from a more medieval incarnation of our language. And there's even more word nerdery to geek out about here, because the lazy lob part of Bilbo's taunt also reflects some of Tolkien's linguistic genius. In an ancient Proto-Germanic language, lubo was a word meaning either something that is lumpish and unwieldy, or something that dangles loosely. For this reason, in certain Anglo-Saxon dialects, lob and lop both became words for silkworms that dangle on threads, and for spiders that dangle from webs. Interestingly, the lob in lobster also reflects this same Germanic root. The Anglo-Saxons took a look at the crawling crustaceans with their bulbous bodies and 8 legs and decided to effectively classify them as a giant, lumpish sea spider. And so bringing all of this back to The Lord of the Rings, even though Tolkien is famous for inventing lots of different elvish languages, Shelob is not an example of one. What her name literally means is simply female spider, Shelob, in the language of his beloved Anglo-Saxons. Anyway, getting back to the actual story, much like her mother, Shelob is a fascinating but highly mysterious villain. Very different from other evil creatures that we meet, like dragons or balrogs or trolls or werewolves. And what limited information we do get about her is really quite terrifying. So, by the time of The Lord of the Rings, Shelob is ancient. We can't say much with absolute certainty, but we can be confident her life began in Ered Gorgoroth, or in Nandun-Gortheb. She was among the first generation that Ungoliant spawned with the foul creatures of spider form that dwelt there. And many thousands of years later, she was Ungoliant's last surviving daughter. During the First Age, Shelob and her siblings, / also her miserable mate, / also her food source, she devoured the spider siblings that she reproduced with, and she also ate many of her own children. She is certainly her mother's daughter when it comes to blind, endless gluttony. Anyway, Shelob and the monster spiders that she didn't eat made Nandun Gortheb a truly hellish place throughout the First Age. We know very little in the way of details, but we do know that towards the beginning of the tale of Beren and Luthien, Beren had to pass through the Valley of Dreadful Death and fight some of its inhabitants as part of a harrowing journey away from his homeland. And so there is a decent chance that before Beren met Luthien, he first crossed paths with Shelob. Which is especially interesting considering that Shelob's mother, Ungoliant, briefly tried going toe-to-toe with Luthien's mother, Queen Melian the Maya. Anyway, the only thing that we can really say about Shelob and her fellow monstrous spiders of the First Age is that they were well enough known to the elves of Beleriand that the elves forged blades specifically designed to be able to cut through their defences. In The Lord of the Rings, Sam tries hacking through Shelob's webs with his barrow blade made by the Dunedain in the early Third Age, but his weapon only bounces off the webs and gets tangled in them. But then Frodo says, "Come, let us see what Sting can do. It is an elven blade, and there were webs of horror in the dark ravines of Beleriand where it was forged." And with a single strike, Sting is able to cut through Shelob's webs like a scythe through grass. However, beyond that, all we can say about Shelob's life in the First Age is that at the end of the First Age, the land she inhabits and all the lands surrounding it are drowned and sink beneath the waves. Shelob is, of course, not drowned with them. Somehow she finds her way many miles into the south, and she comes to dwell in the Mountains of Shadow, the Afelduath that mark the western border of what's going to go on to be called Mordor. And there, in a dark pass, she builds a new home that will, in after days, be known as Torek Ungol, or Shelob's lair. Tolkien tells us how Shelob came there, flying from ruin no tales tell, but still, she was there before Sauron, and before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat with endless brooding on her feasts, weaving webs of shadow, for all living things were her food, and her vomit darkness. This really demonstrates another close parallel between Shelob and her mother. And although there is no evidence to suggest Shelob ever left her lair in the 6,500 years between arriving there and stinging Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, the repercussions of her existence there were felt far and wide. Her lesser broods, bastards of the miserable mates, her own offspring that she slew, spread from glen to glen, from the Afelduath to the eastern hills, to Dol Guldur and the fastness of Mirkwood. But none could rival her, Shelob the Great, last child of Ungoliant to trouble the unhappy world. And this brings us to the interesting question of Shelob's motives. Melkor's motive is to bring all of creation under his dominion and to pollute it. Sauron's motive is to craft a world that he views as perfect. But Shelob? Even by their standards, what Shelob desires truly is the stuff of nightmares. Unlike almost all other monsters, except for her mother, Shelob is no servant of any Dark Lord, and she really doesn't want anything tangible. We are told little she knew of or cared for towers or rings or anything devised by mind or hand, who only desired death for all others, mind and body. The one ring that the Dark Lord desires so immensely means nothing to her. However, that is not to say there is no relationship between Shelob and Sauron. He knew where she lurked, it pleased him that she should dwell there hungry but unabated in malice, a more sure watch upon the ancient path into his land than any other that his skill could have devised. And orcs? They were useful slaves, but he had them in plenty. If, now and again, Shelob caught them to stay her appetite, she was welcome. He could spare them. And sometimes, as a man may cast a dainty to his cat he calls her, but she owns him not, Sauron would send her prisoners that he had no better uses for. He would have them driven to her hole, and report brought back to him of the play she made. So they both lived, delighting in their own devices, and feared no assault, nor wrath, nor any end of their wickedness. Never yet had any fly escaped from Shelob's webs. And this does make Shelob relatively unique. There are lots of villains who are straight up servants of Sauron, for example, the Nazgul, and there are some villains who are totally separate from him, for example, the Balrog beneath Moria. But Shelob seems to inhabit a fascinating kind of middle ground. She is part of Sauron's defenses, but he does not own her. His will has no power over hers, and yet he chooses to keep her around, even to feed her and support her. I can't think of any other character who has that sort of relationship with Sauron. And I don't want to get stuck on a minor detail here, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention a very interesting choice of phrasing on Tolkien's part here. He wrote, "As a man may cast a dainty to his cat he calls her, but she owns him not." The first time I read that, I took it to mean Shelob is a little bit like Sauron's pet cat, except he doesn't really own her. But that is not what Tolkien's saying. He wrote, she owns him not. Tolkien seems to be implying that when someone has a pet cat, the cat owns them. Which does kind of make sense. Most pet cats I know have way more influence over their humans' behaviors than the humans have to influence their cat. The species that's been domesticated and owned in this relationship does seem to be the human. The fundamental difference between Shelob and Sauron and cats and humans, she owns him not. It's kind of a hilarious take, and yet, in my estimation, totally accurate. Anyway, getting back to the point of this video, there is one other villain who Shelob has a fascinating little relationship with, and that is, of all people, Gollum. Years before Gollum led Frodo and Sam into Shelob's lair, he beheld Shelob for the first time, and he had bowed and worshipped her, and he had promised to bring her food. Now, the exact nature of Gollum's relationship with Shelob is unknown, but we do know that while Frodo and Sam rested together on the stairs of Cirith Ungol before entering her lair, Gollum slunk off to meet with his quote-unquote ally in secret. As you surely already know, Gollum had already sworn a promise on the precious to not hurt Master, and so he required Shelob to do the hurting for him. In Gollum's own inner monologue, "It may well be that when she throws away the bones and the empty garments, we shall find it, the precious, a reward for poor Smeagol who brings nice food." I don't want to imply Shelob and Gollum have anything close to a friendly relationship. Neither one of these characters is really capable of maintaining a friendship, but they do have some sort of dark and transactional alliance. Before the events of The Lord of the Rings, Gollum was known to the orcs of Cirith Ungol as Shelob's sneak. In exchange for his own life, Gollum brought Shelob fatter and juicier meats, and she tolerated his existence because he was a reasonably effective hunting dog. He was too thin and wiry to be particularly delicious, but when he lured orcs into her lair, she benefited from the free food. Similarly, the orcs of the area knew to avoid Gollum and let him live because they feared the implicit protection that Shelob offered to her sneak. But, of course, as we all know, Gollum's alliance with Shelob did not end up going the way he had intended. There was one thing he hadn't accounted for: the Starglass of Galadriel, aka the Light of Eärendil, the light that was in the Silmarils that Melkor denied to her mother Ungoliant, the light that had once shone from the two trees of Valinor all those many millennia ago. When Frodo summoned that light and Shelob's bulbous eyes beheld it, doubt came into them. No brightness so deadly had ever afflicted them before. From sun and moon and star they had been safe underground, but now a star had descended into the very earth. For a little while, Shelob withdraws in fear, and Gollum's plan begins to go wrong. But what the hobbits don't realise, Shelob has many exits from her lair. Before long, her squelching body and her creaking legs appear again. She avoids Sam, who is currently holding the Starglass, and instead she pursues Frodo. Frodo flees. Sam rushes after him, but suddenly a long clammy hand grabs him from behind. While Shelob deals with the ring-bearer, Gollum attempts to murder Sam. But once again, he miscalculates. Sam fights back with violence and strength that Gollum simply did not think the seemingly slow and stupid hobbit was capable of. Eventually, Gollum flees, and Sam resists the urge to chase after him. His master needs him. Sam sprints through the dark passage and finds Frodo lying face up with the monstrous spider bending over him. And thus begins one of the top 10 most epic duels in all of Tolkien's writings: Shelob the Great versus Samwise the Gardener, still wielding the light of Eärendil. And with that light, Sam Gamgee becomes the first being ever in history to truly hurt Shelob. He takes up his fallen master's blade, Sting, which was of course named by Bilbo after he used it to hurt and kill Shelob's spawn in Mirkwood during The Hobbit, and Sam uses it to cut off one of her claws and to blind one of her eyes. As Shelob thrusts her body down upon Sam's, he holds the point of Sting upward so that Shelob herself provides the necessary strength to pierce her seemingly impenetrable hide. And in that moment, no such anguish had Shelob ever known. Not the doughtiest soldier of old Gondor, nor the most savage orc entrapped had ever thus set blade to her beloved flesh. Sam crouches, and Shelob readies herself to strike again. He sees his own death in the spider's eyes, but then he opens his mouth, and words come out in a language he does not know. A elbereth gilthoniel o menel palanderiel, linalon si dinun gurathos a tyronin fanuilos. After he speaks, the Starglass blazed suddenly like a white torch in his hand. It flamed like a star that sears the dark air with intolerable light. No such terror had ever burned in Shelob's face before. The dreadful infection of light spread from eye to eye. She fell back, her mind in agony. Then, turning her maimed head away, she rolled aside and began to crawl, claw by claw, towards the opening in the dark cliff behind. Shelob was gone, and whether she lay long in her lair nursing her malice and her misery, and in slow years of darkness healed herself from within, this tale does not tell. I find it fascinating how this divine light sits at the heart of both Shelob and Ungoliant stories. But whereas Ungoliant desired the light of the trees and the Silmarils, the same divine light that ends up reflected in the Starglass, Shelob detests it, fears it, and is ultimately wounded by it. I suppose this alludes to a fundamental difference between mother and daughter. Shelob seems to have come from a union between Ungoliant and other foul things in spider's form, whereas Ungoliant apparently came from the void itself. I guess Shelob is at least a being of Middle-earth, whereas the evidence suggests Ungoliant is not even from Arda. Perhaps this is why the light of the West affects them both differently. But ultimately, I think the point of Shelob and Ungoliant is to represent a very different kind of evil from Sauron and Melkor. The Dark Lords represent the evils of tyranny and dominion and spite, whereas the Spider Ladies seem to represent the evils of pure self-interest, gluttony, and nihilism. I guess the Dark Lords are terrifying because of their associations with mastery over others, whereas the Spiders are terrifying because of their association with the void, with nothingness, with the deepest possible darkness. They are personifications of lingering decay, selfish consumption, and unchecked destruction. The kind of destruction that ultimately destroys even itself. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. You can also now support the channel on Patreon or on Ko-fi if you would like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you are at all interested. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.